What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today we're going to discuss how to counter aggro strategies in Star Wars Unlimited. So if Sabine Wren has been giving you a bunch of problems, this might be the video for you. Let's get into it. So, aggro is a style of game plan that's focused on just going for the base and closing the game as quickly as possible. The most prominent aggro leader is Sabine Wren, Galvanized Revolutionary. She's done very well, arguably the strongest leader overall in the game right now, though, there's certainly be arguments about Boba Fett and so on. But Sabine deploys at only 4 resources, which lets her hit the field very quickly. No other leader in Star Wars Unlimited's first set can deploy on 4 resources. There are at least 2 coming in Shadows of the Galaxy that are going to have that same deployment timing, but at least for now, Sabine's the only one. So both sides of Sabine's card let you push damage to the base. On her leader unit side, which I'm highlighting here, she's a 2/5 and on attack deals 1 damage to each enemy base. So if she can attack the base directly, she can essentially hit for 3, 2 from her base power and 1 from her ability. Also, she'll deal 1 damage to the enemy base when she attacks, even if she's blocked by a Sentinel or similar. On the other side, Sabine can exhaust to deal 1 damage to both bases. And you might say, well, damage to both bases, that doesn't sound that good. The fact of the matter is that in general, aggro doesn't care very much about damage to its own base, because the key question is whether or not they're going to be able to destroy you before you stabilize. And damage to their base doesn't matter that much because you generally can't race aggro. Now, some decks might be able to, but most decks can't really race aggro, so they don't really mind damaging their own base as long as they're damaging your base in the process. Typically, aggro decks are going to try to ignore your units and just go for the base as much as possible, and they will often have reach cards like For a Cause I Believe In. So this is a card, 3-cost event, reveal the top 4 cards of your deck. For each heroism card revealed this way, deal 1 damage to an enemy base. You may discard any of the revealed cards and put the rest back on top of your deck in any order. This is a really strong card because not only can it deal direct damage to the base, which not very many cards in the game overall do, but additionally, the reveal of those top cards and ability to discard them or leave them on top allows you to dig for other reach cards. So maybe the opponent plays For a Cause I Believe In, it leaves you on low HP, and in those 4 cards, they see a For a Cause I Believe In, they discard all the other ones, and now they're going to get their second copy to maybe close the game next turn. Alternatively, maybe they find the Millennium Falcon, Sneak Attack, some other card that they can potentially use to push damage to the base more directly. Or maybe they don't see anything like that at all. They see a bunch of small units and they discard all 4 and are just digging deeper to get to those extra reach cards faster. So as a whole, these builds can be very threatening. And this video is going to go over some of the ways that you can potentially counter them. But, an old principle in strategy is know your enemy. So before we get all the way into the counters, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the aggro game plan. So here we go. Know your enemy game, aggro game plan turn 1. It's generally really important for aggro decks to have a turn 1 play. What they normally want to do is deploy an aggressive unit like Sabine Wren, Explosives Artist, who I've highlighted here, Battlefield Marine, Green Squadron A-Wing. Ideally, it's something that can threaten 3 damage with a single attack. 2 damage is sometimes okay, depending on the situation. And often these are also going to be units that are fairly resilient. So the strongest, most popular plays are things like Unit Sabine, Battlefield Marine, Green Squadron A-Wing, that all have 3 HP. Units with high power but low HP, like Greedo, aren't actually as popular in aggro decks most of the time because they are more vulnerable to certain removal effects. Almost anything can trade into them or even defeat them without trading, and that can generally be a dangerous position to be in. If going second, aggro will often try to arena dodge the opponent, or they may try to do that. I personally think it's a tactic people should often use. That's where you try to ensure that your starting hand has an opening play that you can do on ground as well as one in space, and you go for whichever one your opponent did not put a unit in. So if I'm the aggro player and I'm arena dodging you, if you play a Viper Probe Droid, I'm going to play my space unit. But if you play an early space unit, I'm going to play something like Sabine and put the pressure on the ground arena instead. And ideally, through arena dodging or just having the initiative or whatever, the early unit will land significant damage, maybe even attacking multiple times. One other note is that against mini decks, aggro does tend to prefer a space opening, at least the Rebel aggro decks that are very prominent. So, just a little thing to consider. On turn 2, aggro wants to push damage and expand their board. Cards like this Fleet Lieutenant, a 3-cost 3/3 ground unit. When played, you may attack with a unit. If it's a rebel unit, it gets +2/+0 for this attack. Cards like this Fleet Lieutenant are a great way to do both of those at once, because if you play Fleet Lieutenant, not only are you pushing damage by attacking with a buffed unit, you're also expanding your board by developing a 3/3 that can potentially attack on future turns to add some more damage. If you manage to counter their opening play, aggro will lose some pace. So as an example, let's say that the Sabine player plays Sabine Wren, and you take the initiative immediately and then play open fire to clear it. In that sort of situation, if they had this Fleet Lieutenant, it's not going to get very much value because it won't benefit from the when played ability. Now, in some cases, people will select units that are good for switching lanes or good for being played after the initial thing is countered. A good example of that is the Fighters for Freedom, a card that I was skeptical about at first, but have come back to playing even in Green Sabine thanks to some testing and arguments from the KTOD guys. So shout out to KTOD for that one. But having high HP can be quite important, and a 3-cost 3/4 unit like the Fighters for Freedom or the Rogue Operative or Ezra, those sorts of units can be quite relevant because early units generally can only deal 3 damage. So if they played an A-Wing, you played Viper Probe Droid, you shoot down their A-Wing, and they played a 3/3 unit or a 4/3 unit, your Probe Droid can trade. But if they play a 3/4, your Probe Droid is not in a great spot unless you have shoot first or something. Wing Leader is a card that can develop a small space unit while giving a unit 2 experience. At one time, this was one of the best cards in the game, at least with the things that were previewed early on. It's generally less prevalent now than it was earlier because it is vulnerable to disruption and that's not as good tempo-wise, but it is still a very strong play, especially in a scenario where there is a race going on or where the opponent is unlikely to have things that can counter the buffed units. However, aggro does want to have initiative, especially early in the game, and things like the Fleet Lieutenant can be really good for that. That's one other important note with Sabine. So when she is not deployed, she can exhaust to deal 1 damage to each base. That is good, and it's something that aggro wants to do, but in a lot of situations, it's going to be stronger for them to just take the initiative rather than using that ability, so they can ensure that their units can attack without potentially being removed. All right. On turn 3, this is a really big turn for the Sabine Wren aggro decks because this is the turn where Sabine herself gets to deploy and start swinging. Wing Leader, if they do have it, will often be used on Sabine because that way it's not going to get bounced off the board or whatever. Other strong plays include K2SO, Cassian's counterpart, General Dodonna. Metal Ceremony on this turn can be quite relevant. So Metal Ceremony is a weird card that gives an experience to each of up to 3 rebel units that attack this phase, and it costs 0. So what they can sometimes do on turn 3 is attack with 2 or 3 units, depending on how effective you've been at clearing their early stuff, then play Metal Ceremony for a bunch of buffs for free, and go into future turns in a stronger spot. The goal of the aggro deck is to deal damage and develop a board. They'll often lose the initiative at this phase, but deploying Sabine really helps their overall momentum, and they'll usually want to do it as soon as possible. Maybe not if you have a really obvious answer, but in general, deploying Sabine helps the momentum, and this is part of why Sabine can be such a strong leader. So for turn 4 and beyond, aggro often tends to start falling behind on board during these turns, but ideally for the aggro player, they've done enough damage that it won't matter. They can use things like Surprise Strike or Noble Sacrifice that buff their units for an attack to try and help close. And if the opponent manages to fully stabilize, then it's reach time, and the aggro player can switch to going for things like For a Cause, maybe playing out units to buy time, even if they're going to get removed. If the opponent hits them, that gives the aggro player more time to draw reach. If the opponent doesn't hit them, they can potentially get in one way or another and deal damage to the base. For a Cause, I believe in is the premier reach card, and we covered that earlier, but there's also other options like the Falcon, Sneak Attack. Those are both things that can come into play ready. Some decks might play things like Keep Fighting. Double Red can play Aggression. Both of those can be used to ready a unit that you just played or a unit that already attacked to potentially do an extra attack the opponent's not prepared for. K2SO can deal damage when defeated. There's other stuff too, but reach can be quite relevant. And so that's the overall aggro game plan. And it's worth noting also that like if you're playing a build where your leader deploys on like 6 or more resources, you might actually not get a chance to use your leader against aggro if their plan is going really well. It is, and that's not like some rare like 5% of the time this can happen. No, it's like if you're playing Vader or Palpatine or even a 6 resource leader, and you're not slowing down the opponent very effectively, they can win the game before your leader deploys. Decks like, sometimes you'll see like Luke Skywalker, or I'm sorry, Luke Skywalker, Faithful Friend. Like those decks can lose the game before Luke deploys if they're not doing a good job at fighting aggro. Yeah, it's a very fast deck. And so now we're going to get from the aggro game plan to the mission briefing here for countering aggro. So here are some general tips that will help out. First up, you want to try to force unit combat instead of just having the opponent have easy attacks on your base. So if you can use things like Sentinel or things that have high restore values, stuff like that, that can force the opponent into trying to clear those units rather than going for base. You generally don't want to pressure the aggro player's base. You generally want to focus on trying to remove their units and get the initiative. I often think that it's more worth it to take the initiative rather than swing with a small unit. So like, let's say that you play a regional governor early and prevent the opponent from playing fleet lieutenant or wing leader or something. That can be a strong play, but in future turns, it might be better to just take the initiative rather than attack with that wing leader for just 1 damage. Because by taking the initiative, you might get yourself the opportunity to clear a more powerful unit before it can attack, and you will have time to push for the enemy base once you've stabilized. I covered this a bit earlier, but if you try to race aggro with a slower deck, you're probably just going to lose. You generally want to use removal and disruption effects to stop important units from attacking, and be very careful about playing ramp and card draw actions, especially ones that don't get you other value. So like this mission briefing card that I have highlighted kind of for the pun or whatever is actually a really bad card to play against Sabine because you don't have time to do things like this. You need to be trying to clear or stabilize the board. Okay. So let's get into some specifics. So restore and heal effects can be very useful when countering aggro. So aggro tends to lack late game inevitability and will usually lose an extended end game if you can heal and get to your stronger cards. Let's say that you stabilize and you've taken like 12 damage, you have 13 HP left. Sabine is not going to be able to use her resource for 13 or her ability to deal 1 damage to your base 13 times in a row to win. It's very unlikely. So staving off damage to your base with restore and stuff like that helps buy time to get to that end game. Cards like Consortium Star Viper here, which is a unit that has good stats for fighting aggro's early ships and also has restore, can really help out. Yoda, who has restore 2 himself, can really help. Consortium Star Viper's restore is conditional, but it's still a big factor. And even if your opponent attacks these units to clear them and prevent you from restoring, hey, that's damage not hitting base. So other heals like that on Make an Opening here can help. Make an Opening is an event that not only debuffs a unit, it also heals some damage from your base. Ideally, you can use this to defeat a unit and also heal, which is quite strong. And Vigilance maybe deserves a special mention for being a card that can be worth it even when played off aspect for 6 resources. So Vigilance is a 4-cost double blue event. Choose 2 in any order, discard 6 cards from an opponent's deck, heal 5 damage from base, defeat a unit with 3 or less remaining HP, and give a shield token to a unit. Against aggro, the best choices are very likely going to be heal 5 damage from base and defeat a unit with 3 or less remaining HP. Sometimes giving a shield to a Sentinel or whatever might be good, but in general, healing and defeating is very strong with this card, and actually strong enough that this is a relevant card against aggro even if you're playing it for 6. All right. And if you're playing it for 4, it is really good. It is so good to have Vigilance for 4 against aggro. So if you happen to have a double blue deck, you should absolutely be playing Vigilance in there, and it could help you a lot. All right, moving on, Sentinels. So cards with Sentinel can also force unit combat. Sentinel is a keyword that makes it so that units in this arena can't attack your non-Sentinel units or your base. So the opponent, if I play this Cell Block Guard, 3-cost 3/3 Sentinel, and my opponent has a Battlefield Marine, they can't attack base. They have to attack the Cell Block Guard. And yeah, they traded 1 for 1, and their card cost less. So in a sense, they're ahead. But this is the kind of thing that I want. I want these unit combats to be happening. I want to prevent damage from base, and therefore that feels like a good situation for the defensive player. Now, ideally, the opponent will have to lose a unit to clear the way when defeating the Sentinel. Sometimes this is difficult because unconditional Sentinel units often have inefficient stats overall. Like this Cell Block Guard is 3 for a 3/3. You really want to have 7 points of stats for a 3-cost unit, so 3 for a 3/4 or 4/3 or 2/5 or whatever. However, there are conditional Sentinel units that have better stats but aren't reliable. So here we have the Emperor's Royal Guard, a 3-cost 3/4, but it only has Sentinel when you control an official unit. So this card can be quite good if you're in a deck that has early officials that it wants to play, because a 3/4 Sentinel can really impede the opponent. But there are those situations where you might not have the official to enable it. As a result, Emperor's Royal Guard is a lot better if your leader is an official, because then you can get this effect going more reliably. Keep in mind also that aggro might have ways around Sentinel. Just having a Sentinel doesn't necessarily mean you're safe. So for instance, the opponent might play Spec Force Soldier, a 1-cost 2/2 ground unit. When played, a unit loses Sentinel for this phase, and that might, disabling Sentinel on a key unit for the phase might allow them to get a few more attacks in and potentially win the game. There's other things too that could happen. They could play Change of Heart on your Sentinel if they're in a Cunning build. Units with the Saboteur keyword can just attack past Sentinels. So Sentinel is not like the be-all end-all. Having a Sentinel doesn't mean you're totally safe, but it does help a lot. All right, let's move on to disruption. So disruption cards like exhaust, bounce, those sorts of effects can be especially helpful against aggro. No Good to Me Dead here, for instance, a 2-cost cunning villainy event. Exhaust a unit that unit can't ready this round, including during the regroup phase. It's a great way to slow down aggro. Playing this on Sabine is really handy because now Sabine can't attack you probably for 2 turns, this turn and the next one. And because she is deployed and not defeated yet, she can't use her ability to deal 1 damage to each base either. Buying time can be a very relevant tactic to help you stabilize and get into a strong position. Exhausting key units before they attack gives you time to clean up. But disruption also does need to be paired with other effects. So if you just keep playing exhaust cards and you never have your own units coming in to clear the board, you never have anything like that, the opponent will eventually win. If you're just bouncing their stuff and they just replay it and you don't have a longer term solution, that doesn't really work on its own. You need some units or some other removal to actually clean them up. But that being said, exhaust and bounce can be really good. A bounce card like Waylay is a great answer to K2SO because it gets him off the board without triggering his when defeated effect. And yeah, those sorts of things can be quite handy. Now, next we're going to discuss removal. So specifically cheap removal. So Vanquish here is actually not a card that you always want against aggro. So 5-cost event that defeats a non-leader unit, that sounds like it could be good, but the problem is it's just too expensive. Most aggro decks don't play very many expensive units at all. It's not uncommon to see Sabine decks where the top of the curve is like 5 or even 4 resources. And that makes expensive removal, especially single target removal, inefficient. So Vanquish can be good if the opponent has like a big reach unit like the Gorilla Attack Pod or Fett's Fire Spray in a villain deck, coming into play ready. But it's too expensive to impede aggro's early game units very much, because if you're playing 5 to remove a Battlefield Marine, and then they have 5 resources and they play 2 more units, you're probably overall behind on that. Cheap removal is a lot better. So we have things like Power of the Dark Side. This can be a really good card against aggro. Just forcing them to defeat a unit can be especially handy. Often what you'll see is aggro, if aggro is going first, maybe they play a unit and the opponent will just take the initiative and play Power of the Dark Side immediately to get that unit off the field. Open Fire can be another good one. So Open Fire here is 3 for 4 damage to a unit. That one has the advantage over Power of the Dark Side that it can, if the opponent plays like R2 or some small unit or has like an exhausted wing leader or whatever, they can't just choose that one to be defeated and keep their more powerful thing. And these sorts of cheap removal cards work a lot better than things like Vanquish. Force Choke is pretty reasonable. And there's also some things that aren't true removal, but are still very handy to have. So one would be Entrenched, and a 2-cost upgrade that gives a unit +3/+3, but the attached unit can't attack bases. This can actually be really good played on your opponent's units to prevent them from attacking. So as an example, if your opponent has Sabine out there and you play Entrenched on her, yeah, she's dangerous to ground units. But if your goal is to be playing removal and disruption and stuff and not necessarily doing all that much unit combat, which some decks, for some decks that might be their goal, that can really set them back. Or you play Entrenched on a space unit if the opponent has control of the space arena, and now they can't really do a lot. Another fake removal option or not exact removal thing that can be good is Shoot First, which allows you to conduct unit combat more efficiently. And those sorts of cheap cards that can tilt things in your favor can be very nice. Next, let's talk mass removal or bulk removal. Other removal cards can be affected by removing multiple units. So the best in this category is probably Overwhelming Barrage, which is an event that gives a friendly unit +2/+2 for the phase, and then it deals damage equal to its power, divided as you choose among any number of other units. And the reason that's so good is because you can divide that across a bunch of things. So if you play Overwhelming Barrage on a 4-power unit, make it a 6/6, you can now defeat, if they have a unit with 3 HP, a unit with 2 HP, and a unit with 1 HP, you can defeat all 3 of those with 1 card, which is really good. Bombing run here. Bombing run can work, but it requires fairly specific situations. 5-cost event, choose an arena, ground, or space, and deal 3 damage to each unit in that arena. The problem is if your opponent is mixed across multiple arenas, this card gets a lot worse. And it would also be a lot better if it said 4 damage instead of 3, but it can still be handy in the right situation. If the opponent has like a horde of space units, this can be a great response. And then you have some other bulk removal options. So like Super Laser Blast can help. Emperor Palpatine, the unit, can help. But these cards kind of arrive a bit late. In general, you want things that can stop aggro earlier. Now, one note is that Barrage does require a good enabler because it is based on giving a friendly unit +2/+2 for the phase. And you need to have a unit with high power. In some cases, aggro can kill your unit there to deny you the barrage, but hey, if they're playing around you like that, at least they spent something attacking a unit instead of the base. You know what I mean? So yeah. Bombing run doesn't have that downside, but it is a bit conditional just based on the opponent having units that line up against it and having them all in one arena. So one other point that I want to give about playing against aggro is the pivot turn. So if you manage to stop that early aggression and stabilize, hey, good job. But now it becomes important to pivot from playing defense to playing offense. And knowing when to do that can be quite relevant. So the thing is, if you are just defeating their units over and over again and not really advancing any win condition of your own and just extending the game, you might die to reach cards before you can actually turn things around and win. So instead, it becomes relevant to try and turn around and start pivoting to attacking their base and using some of your stuff on that instead of just playing defense. Often it can be good to do this when you're going to win in 1 or 2 turns of making attacks. If you're low on HP on your base, you might want to keep clearing units longer. And if you're high on HP, maybe they had a bad early game, you used early removal stuff to really shut them down, then you can pivot faster and start pushing damage to their base earlier. It is important that you do this at some point. It becomes less important to pivot quickly also if you have healing effects and stuff like that makes it so that you aren't going to inevitably lose to reach cards. But for some decks, they don't really have enough healing to actually like do all that much. So in theory, if they just constantly defend and never attack, they lose to the opponent drawing all there for a cause I believe in and stuff. In any case, it can also be good to pivot just to close the game out faster. But yeah, once you're in that spot where you're like, okay, I'm feeling pretty stable, I've cleared the board, they might deploy some units, but I can deal with them. Now it's time to start hitting the base. And once you start doing that, you can turn things around and hopefully get the win. So that's the overall that's kind of the overall game plan against aggro. Now, one note that I'll say is when you're selecting a leader, let's say that you've gone over this stuff and you just haven't quite figured out like, oh, what is it? Like aggro is still such a problem. Like what deck should I play to beat aggro? Well, one consideration to give you is leader timing. Sabine is the fastest leader timing in the game at the moment. Like I said earlier, this is going to change with Shadows of the Galaxy, but leaders with much slower timing like Vader or Palpatine are really going to struggle just because Sabine is going to hit the field much sooner than your leader and can be pushing damage early and causing some problems. Even a leader that deploys on 6 resources can feel kind of slow against Sabine. So it might be worth considering a leader that deploys earlier if you are up against aggro a lot at your local store. So, maybe let's say I'm thinking about doing Palpatine Blue. And I'm like, man, even with the restore and stuff that I'm getting from playing Vigilance, even with even with Lieutenant Childson and other Sentinel stuff, I just can't hold them back. It's not working. Well, it might be worth considering making a switch, and maybe instead of playing Palpatine Blue, I'm going to play Krennic Green. So relative to Palpatine, Krennic is certainly a lot weaker in those aggro games, in those control games, and those like games against mid range and stuff. Krennic is a lot lower impact than Palpatine, but Krennic also deploys way faster and has Restore too. So maybe if I go from Palpatine Blue to Krennic Green, I'm going to be in a better spot against aggro just on the basis of leader selection. And, this is the last of my tips here just because, hey, pick a different leader and play a different deck is kind of a, major thing to recommend. But it is worth noting that, deploying your leader is a big power spike in the game, and you don't want to miss yours by having the opponent close the game before your leader has time to hit the field. And leaders with healing, like Director Krennic or Iden Versio, can be especially relevant because that healing helps them get towards the later game. All right, so to sum it all up, guys, if you want to stop Sabine, I would suggest focusing on clearing units, not attacking the enemy base, trying to keep the board small to prevent damage. In general, using healing and sentinel units can help impede the opponent's offense. You then want to use unit combat, disruption effects, and cheap, efficient removal or mass removal that hits multiple things to clear the opponent's units efficiently. Don't focus on doing damage to the enemy base until you've stabilized overall with a lot of builds. After you've stabilized the board, then you can pivot and go for the win. Just watch out for those sneaky reach cards they might use to close things before that. These aren't the only tactics you can use against aggro. There's also, like, some decks can try to race. Some decks can try to play tempo or aggro control strategies that are a bit more complicated. But in general, this is sort of the I'm gonna be the control player, you're gonna be the beatdown. Here's what I'm gonna try to do to stop aggro. These are strategies that can be applied by a lot of decks without doing anything super complicated or super timing intensive. And hopefully these will be some useful tools for you if you find yourself in a meta with a lot of aggro decks. Maybe this will help you out. So one last question for you guys: what has worked for you? If you are an aggro player, what sort of strategies do you not like to see? If you are a player who's had a lot of success against aggro, what sort of tactics have been good for you in defeating those aggro players? I'd be interested to hear from you guys in the comments section below. And that's going to about do it for this one. Otherwise, thanks to you all for watching. If you're interested in seeing more Star Wars Unlimited content, feel free to subscribe to the channel, or don't if you don't want to see more stuff like this. Absolutely your call. Also, if you liked the video, feel free to like it. And if you disliked the video, please do dislike it. I know it sounds sort of weird, like it's not like people don't normally call for viewers to dislike their videos if they didn't like them, but like it actually does help me know what sort of stuff is or isn't popular. So yeah, that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thanks again for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.